Literacy is dead. At least that's what a lot of people are saying. We don't think it's true. We do, however, think literacy is about to look different, a lot different. For many people, the words "the end" signify either satisfaction or sorrow. What happens after the end? How do words become catalysts for progress and advancement?
Join us today for the Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. Hi, I'm Amy Boland, literacy specialist, writer, and college instructor.
And I'm Holland Webb, a full-time writer and editor. And this is the Afterword.
Well, we are glad to be back in the studio today, Holland. And you know, genealogy is the second most popular hobby in America after gardening.
They say 6 million people have taken the Ancestry DNA test, and millions more go to those online sites and cemeteries and archives to find their family stories.
In fact, genealogy is so popular that it's been featured in The New Yorker, Psychology Today, and Live Science. While genealogy has experienced a recent resurgence, it's not a new hobby, though. Native American archaeology shows that people were tracing their ancestors thousands of years ago. And besides, let's think about all those begats in the Bible.
When we started talking about this, I thought of genealogy as something sort of historic. I mean, contemporary people look ahead, right? We're focused on technology and the future. So my questions are, what makes modern future-oriented people so fascinated with the stories of the past? And how do you go about finding the tales of romance and suspense that happened in your own family? Then once you've discovered those stories, kind of who cares? I mean, what are you going to do with them?
Right. And, you know, to answer that question, because obviously we aren't the experts here.
No.
We always find these...
We're never the experts.
We found these wonderful guests today. We've brought together Anne Norton, a professional genealogist, and Elizabeth Goddard, a romantic suspense novelist. Elizabeth is a best-selling novelist with 40 books to her credit. Her books have won a Carol Award and been nominated for a Daphne du Maurier. Oh, I'm going to blow that name anyway.
You did great.
Okay. Award for Excellence in Mystery and Suspense. Elizabeth's most recent novel is entitled Never Let Go. It features a forensic genealogist who pursues answers about her past as she investigates a cold case abduction. So Elizabeth, welcome. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I am a seventh-generation Texan, and I was a DRT, the Daughter of the Republic of Texas member. I have a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from the University of North Texas, and for a few years I worked in corporate America selling software. But eventually I stayed home with my first child, and I decided I wanted to pursue writing. I just couldn't get that out of my system, and I never looked back. I just started writing, attended conferences, and it's been a great thing because I have a whole new career now going on 20 years, and I love it.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing.
And to accompany Elizabeth, we have Anne Norton, a retired librarian who's worked primarily in genealogy and local history at Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library and Denver Public Library. And lest you think of a traditional librarian, let me say that Anne has also pursued research as a competitive intelligence analyst in the corporate world. She is a student of the oral tradition, having grown up with a grandfather who could not read or write. She's traveled twice to Northern Ireland to do genealogical research and has taught Irish migration and guest lectured on African American literature at Lander University. Anne, welcome. Tell us more about yourself.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I am originally from the South, born and raised outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and went to college there. Became very interested in local history and genealogy, actually, because I grew up next to a cemetery. I could crawl out my bedroom window and walk into a cemetery. So I played in a cemetery, and I made up stories, and I had questions about who was buried there and why were they there, and why were these 3 children all buried the same month? What happened to those people? And I grew up in an interesting family, some of whom were very literate. My mother could recite poetry, and we listened to the old caveman records, with the Okay, tonight we're going to listen to Robert Frost read his poetry. And then flip that over. I had a grandfather who could not read and write. He went to work in the cotton mill when he was 7 years old and he never left. But he was a terrific storyteller. So all of that melded together into my curious brain.
That sounds like a great combination. And again, coming back to one of the things that we keep hearing over and over again is story. And so, Elizabeth, first of all, as we get started in our questions, what got you interested in genealogy or telling stories that include genealogy as a component?
Well, I think back to what Anne was talking about, where she looked at the cemeteries and she wanted to figure out who or what the background was. And the same thing kind of with my own family. Genealogy is a familiar topic to me because I grew up surrounded by amateur genealogists, namely my mother, my grandmother, my aunt, and they seem to spend a lot of time visiting cemeteries, old churches, to look at registers or archives, and so many things they had to do. They had to travel to different states searching for our family history. Many of those things you can do now on the internet. So that's just, of course, exploded. But I grew up in this environment, and so was always talking about who did what and all of these stories wrapping around my head. So, yeah, there was just so many stories that as an avid reader and someone who wanted to write, they just kind of settled inside of me. And really, it's just like any character in a novel who is looking into the past, if you think about it like this, or they're looking at their ancestors to find answers. Let's say, I'm writing suspense most of the time, so that's going to happen. But if they're going to be delving into genealogy, whether they call it that or not, they're looking into their past, they're looking into their ancestors. So it's not really a stretch for me to include a genealogist into my story. It's not really a stretch for me to do that. My grandmother actually created a book, and I'll talk about it later, but it's called From These Roots, where she has all the family history written down. So anyway, genealogy is just in my veins.
Wow, that's awesome.
I have met some interesting people, but I've never had a conversation in which one person said, I could crawl out my window and play in a cemetery as a child. And the next person said, my mother spent a lot of time in cemeteries growing up. We're already off to a great start. So I'm actually more interested in the future. I was on Twitter at midnight last night, which tells you something about my life. But I was on Twitter talking about how exciting I think this time is right now. We're looking at so many fascinating things that are happening in the world that haven't really happened before or haven't happened like this. And what do you think shapes this deep-rooted interest in the past that so many people have at the same time as we have this interest in the future?
Well, first of all, I want to disagree with you.
Okay.
Because I do not believe that the future and what we're experiencing right now is so different from what we have experienced in the past. Mm-hmm. And the more I study history, the more I realize we're in a cycle. We are in a big circle. And a lot of the situations that are happening today have happened in the past. And we have not learned from them. We have not taken the lessons from them. And so there's my first disagreement. First, I say. But I think the deep-rooted interest is really twofold. First is ego. People want to know about themselves. And having been doing this since 1978, I'm the old-timer, people want to be related to royalty. They want to be related to revolutionary heroes. It doesn't matter where you live, you want to have that connection. The other is curiosity. So curiosity and ego come together a great deal. Most of us are not related to royalty or descended from royalty. But once we start digging into the past and learning more about our families and their neighbors and their situations and trials and triumphs, the more we recognize ourselves. And we can get inspired from that. And that inspiration, I believe, can turn into an addiction. It's like eating peanuts.
Do you have anything to add to that, Elizabeth?
No, I think she answered it all. The only thing I would say is that I think knowledge is power, right? You've heard that saying. And so delving into the past, I think, can be good for future generations, and knowing that our ancestors, they survived. Obviously, they survived, and it can give them a sense of strength and knowing that they can make it too, no matter how hard it gets. To know that someone in your family, different people have gone through a struggle and that you can survive too. So when I've been reading different stories and looking back, and I thought, we can do it. Our ancestors have done it, and we can do it. And so I think that again, knowledge is power. And looking back, that can help people to keep going forward. That could be a reason for future generations to look back and just to give them a sense of confidence.
That's so interesting to me because I've never really done real genealogy, but I was looking for a family story not too long ago. And my father was a lot older than my mother, so my great-grandmother was born right at the end of the Civil War. And I went on one of those Ancestry.com or Find a Grave. That's where I was, Find a Grave. And I realized that my great-grandmother had 6 children. She outlived 5 children and her husband. And I just thought, how did you do that? As modern people, we talk about microaggressions and are very quickly offended and eager to lash back. And I thought, goodness, this woman buried 5 of her children and her husband over, 65 years or however long she lived. It's incredible as we look back at those things.
Mm-hmm. That's such a good point. And I love the idea. I'm hearing some similar things. Anne, you talked about inspiration and how that ego and that curiosity kind of drives. And I can totally understand the qualitative, addictive piece of learning a little bit more. And so how can a person begin to learn a little bit about their family history? Why don't you share a little bit with that?
I always, in classes, in helping folks get started with genealogy, I always say start with yourself. Absolutely start with yourself on a family tree. Don't try to jump back to who you think you're related to and work back to yourself. Start with yourself and document yourself. I didn't find out until I was 17 years old that I never had a birth certificate. The doctor wasn't in the room when I was born and nobody wrote it down. I could have gone to another family and I didn't realize it. But actually, document yourself and then move to your parents and your siblings. That is the most important thing to do. And a lot of folks skip over that very important part.
That's good advice. That's good advice, because I know we might be able to track a few names down. But then now, what do you do with getting those stories? And Elizabeth, maybe I'll pass this off to you. So, okay, we've started with ourselves. We've documented ourselves, our parents. How then do you go into locating the stories?
To finding the story is like you find a name and then you've got to find the story. I remember my grandmother was always telling us the stories, her family and all the genealogy research she did. And we'd tell her, write this down, Mama. We call her Mama. Write this down, write it down, write it down. And so I have them going through my head, but always thinking that she's writing it down. Well, she didn't write it down, right? And so all we've got is just what she said. But as I mentioned earlier, she did compile, with all of the research they did, a book of the family tree all the way back to a gentleman named Woodson. He was born about 1693. And so she gave me this book in 20 years ago, 1999. And here's the funny thing, is in the book, the birth year is wrong. So it's like, you have to look for diaries. Diaries are important, but you have to hope that people have taken the time to write the stories down. Otherwise, what are you going to do? You're lost.
Right.
I think it's important to remember that as we don't live in a vacuum, our ancestors did not live in a vacuum. I always recommend that folks get their hands on a copy of the county history where their family lived, that they look at maps to determine where their family lived. And here's an example, if I could share this. Last year, I did research on a family that lived near here at the end of the Revolution, up near Pleasant Ridge Park and Jones Gap Park at the end of the Revolution. The woman married at the age of 14. She had 21 children. They all lived. She lived. Why? That was very unusual. Why did she live? How did she survive? Look at the maps. She lived by springs. She lived by running water. They had fresh water. doing more research. They became Thomsonian medicine people, which were herbalists. They practiced herbal medicine. Having fresh water, being aware of this. Now, this is in the 1840s and 50s. I was able to say, I believe this is why that woman survived. After childbirth, she did not go stand in a dirty creek and develop an infection and die. She stood in running water. They were aware of what they were eating. They grew herbs. They grew fresh plants. The children survived. It was very unusual. But that piece came together because you were able to understand that the family did not live in a vacuum.
Fascinating. Wow. Excellent.
What's the essential piece of information we need to understand genealogy and family stories? Anne?
That mythology mingles very nicely with fact.
That's perfect.
And if I'm teaching a class, I always remind my students to keep an open mind, to be compassionate, and that our generation did not invent sex.
That's pretty powerful.
Those three things are...
What?
Oh, my goodness. Elizabeth, have we just broken your bubble a little bit?
I'm just kidding.
So,
What kind of church does your husband pastor?
Oh my gosh, I didn't help myself.
that's awesome.
Elizabeth, did you want to add something to that about what the essential piece of information?
I'm okay with saying I don't know. I don't know. I mean, Anne did a great job with that, but
That was perfect.
Well, I'd like to go down that road a little bit further. How do you know what's mythology and what's a real story from your family's history?
Research. You have to go in and do the research, and you have to find documentation. If it's not documented, if a topic or a person, an event is not documented, it is not valid evidence. You can have circumstantial evidence, but you need to back up those stories with proof. You have to have proof. And that's what takes time. It's not simply clicking on a leaf on Ancestry.com and getting an answer. It takes sometimes years. It takes going to the courthouse, going to the cemetery, not just clicking on a leaf.
Wow, that's good advice. That's good advice. Elizabeth, now that we're not going to be clicking on just leaves, and you've got a character here who is a forensic genealogist, let's delve into that a little bit. Why a forensic genealogist, and what is a forensic genealogist?
those are very good questions. Well, I ran across a newspaper article. I mean, I'm talking a hard copy newspaper. You know, how often does that happen now? That was about a forensic genealogist who assisted police in discovering the identity of a woman who had died. She was, I mean, in her 30s, something like that. And her family around her, I think she was married. I don't remember the details, but they realized, wow, we don't even really know where she came from. Who is her family? So anyway, they hired a forensic genealogist, but she had also helped the police because they couldn't, you know, they needed to discover her background. And she found her family many states away. This woman had chosen to disappear and start a new life, I don't know, 15 or 20 years before. And her biological family, of course, they didn't know why she had left, but they found closure. So I just was like, what is a forensic genealogist? And wow, what a great character, you know, a great thing for a character. It would just be so intriguing, and I hadn't heard of it before. And that's just not something we run across a lot in fiction. So anytime you come across a character or a job or something that is not something familiar, you need to look into that to use that in a story. So I think the second part of your question is what is a forensic genealogist? Well, I had to find that out too, right? What exactly is that? So I got a few books and did my research. And of course, Anne, you know, please feel free to jump in here. But my understanding is there can be a couple of definitions for a forensic genealogist. The first one really has to do with legal issues, like these people are hired to find missing heirs or to help identify unclaimed remains. If there's an issue with the mineral rights or land title or cases of dual citizenship, those kind of things that have to do with the legal and the court system. And they might even appear as an expert witness in a court. The other definition, I believe, it has to do with forensic science approach. And we are all familiar with the DNA, right? Obviously with the DNA, that's such a big thing now. And I think that's part of why genealogy has just really exploded, because people want to know about their background, and there's easy ways to do that now using DNA. I don't know if it's easy or not, but it's a scientific approach. And so those are kind of two different definitions there. In my case, in the case of my character, she is employed to look for missing heirs, and she was employed by this woman to find her missing daughter. So in that case, she kind of used both the scientific and in the case of legal, because when she finds the daughter, they have to prove that she actually is her daughter. So I don't want to give too much of the story away. Hopefully I didn't. Anyway, feel free to jump in there correctly or add something.
I actually have a question that probably you can answer. As we're recording this on Thursday, I believe this happened the previous weekend. There was a 14-year-old boy who showed up in Kentucky. Did you all see this in the news?
That's correct.
14-year-old boy who showed up in Kentucky, and he found the police car, and he said, and he gave his name, and he said, I've been living with other people for 7 years, and I ran away from the last two people who had me to come back to my family, and they're now trying to figure out if he really is who he says he is, and if he's really this boy. There was a case 7 years ago, a boy with that name, his mother had taken him somewhere, and away from the family. They had gone on a vacation for 3 days, and then she died by suicide, and they never found the boy. She said she had put him somewhere safe, and now this kid's turned up claiming that he's that boy. Would a forensic genealogist get involved in that?
Yes, I would think so. Yes. And a lot of the cold case murders that are showing up as being solved, not showing up as being solved, they're being solved with police departments and genealogists working together to track witnesses, to track bloodlines. And what folks don't realize is when you put something on Ancestry.com, you have the option of adding it to other websites for DNA to see if you're connected with someone, but you're also making yourself available to police. And that's how these things happen. Isn't that correct?
Yes, usually the criminals leave behind their DNA, and there's all these cold cases. So police are doing that now. It's really ramped up in the last couple of years, and actually it started ramping up after I wrote my book. They were using the DNA sites, and so if you are a criminal, beware, because your family member may have put their DNA up somewhere, and so forensic genealogists are hired to actually build that family tree from the criminal's DNA. And then they tie it to a family, and then the police take it from there. So that's pretty amazing, using technology and genealogy for that. I just think that's just very interesting. Again, criminals beware.
And they're solving crimes that happened 20, 30 years ago, where people have been living a quote-unquote normal life, and the police show up at the door.
Yeah.
You did this. You can't deny it. We have the DNA.
Right. Right.
And it's fascinating. It's another layer that we never expected. Mm-hmm. Certainly when I started this in 1978, we didn't have computers. This was unthinkable. Mm. But it's very exciting. Mm.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would always work. I have 2 children. Mm-hmm. They are both African American, and I am not. Mm-hmm. So we don't have any DNA that links us. Mm-hmm. Physical DNA. But I have become very interested in what it means to be an African-American person in modern America since I've been related to 2 of them for the last 15 years. And I've discovered that for many minority groups and African-Americans in particular, genealogy can answer a lot of deeply personal questions. My 18 and 19-year-old boys don't seem to have a lot of deeply personal questions, but I know that other people do, and they may at some point develop those questions. Mm-hmm. What are some of the challenges, though, that African-American people and other minorities face when they start that process of discovering their heritage and past?
Excellent question. And this is a primary interest of mine. African American research is extremely difficult. The reason is slaves were brought here and stripped of their identity. They were given a name, a first name only. They were not automatically given their slave owner's name at emancipation. They could choose a name, any name they wanted. So the challenge there would be doing the research After the Civil War would be who was the slave owner. You have to determine who owned that person. The challenge comes up on a very personal level, accepting the fact that your ancestors were property. Mm-hmm. They were not considered human beings. And so when I tell a client that I have to go through bills of sale to find their family, when I have to go through wills to see if they were bequeathed, traded for another piece of property, it's very painful. Mm. And a lot of folks just stop because it's overwhelming emotionally, and it is a tough search. Women are very difficult to research because women were also basically property. When a woman married in the United States and they took English law, everything that they owned went to their husband. They were not allowed to work, to earn a living. They were not allowed to own property. Everything that they owned became their husband's. They had no rights, of course. So you don't have a paper trail that you have for a male, a white male. If she couldn't own property, if she couldn't have an occupation and earn money, she might show up in the census records, but that's all. So you have to keep digging deeper and deeper and find out, well, what church did they go to? Where did they live? Maybe there's a newspaper article. So minorities, and the same is true with poor people. Mm-hmm. Poor people do not leave a paper trail. They don't own property. They might not vote. They might not be able to read and write, so they're not going to have documentation. And the census records, they might not be able to spell their name. The census taker would write it down phonetically. I worked on a family whose last name was Holcomb. It took a long time for me to figure out that it was Holcomb because the family pronounced it Halcomb. They said our last name was Halcomb. So I had to sit down and write it over and over and over again phonetically before I said, oh, these are Holcombs. So there's a lot of other considerations with minority research, but well worth it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Elizabeth, I know that 7 generations of Texans, obviously, that shows an interest in family. And I really appreciate what you're sharing, Anne, that we don't live in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I'm hearing more than anything else, that regardless of whether or not we can find 7 generations of a family, we still are human beings. We still belong in community. We still have opportunity to impact. And Elizabeth, you shared earlier this idea about inspiration. And as we're kind of closing out our first part, Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about where we can find some inspiration from your book, Never Let Go. What's the best way for folks to get a hold of you?
Well, it is available in any brick and mortar store that sells Christian fiction. I just found it in Barnes & Noble this weekend, and I was excited to see it there. And for the folks who want to get their books online, I have a website, elizabethgoddard.com, and I also have an Amazon author page. You know, a lot of people go to that venue to purchase for Kindle or their hard copies, or readers can get a copy of Never Let Go at bakerpublishinggroup.com, which is my publisher. And see the next book coming out, too, is Always Look Twice. So thank you.
When is Always Look Twice coming out?
October is the second book, yes.
October.
Okay.
Right.
Well, we will definitely look forward to that.
And this concludes part 1 of our conversation with professional genealogist Anne Norton and romantic suspense novelist Elizabeth Goddard about how and why to learn and tell your family stories. Join us for part 2 next week. As always, you are welcome at our table, but please leave us feedback on our website because we'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to the afterwordpodcast.com and to like us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.